My name is Isabel Carter. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, people have described me with the same few words: calm, reasonable, easy to talk to. If you asked my family, they might say something even simpler. Isabel keeps the peace. For a long time, that sounded like a compliment. I live in Seattle now, in a quiet neighborhood where the mornings smell like rain and coffee. My work is fairly ordinary. I help manage the financial records for a small family business that my parents started years ago. On paper, my role is practical: spreadsheets, tax filings, invoices, nothing dramatic. But families rarely function only on paper. Inside a family, everyone is given a role. Sometimes that role is chosen. More often, it's quietly assigned. In mine, I became the person who smoothed things over, the one who listened when voices rose, the one who explained the misunderstandings, the one who said, "It's not worth arguing about." I believe that was what maturity looked like. For a long time, I thought peace in a family meant staying quiet. I avoided conflict whenever possible and tried to keep everyone comfortable. Eventually, I realized that silence can mean many different things. Sometimes silence is kindness, sometimes it's patience, and sometimes, though it takes years to recognize it, silence becomes a place where other people quietly decide what your value is. Not loudly, not cruelly, just slowly. The kind of change that doesn't happen in a single argument or dramatic moment. Instead, it happens across dozens of small conversations, small assumptions, small dismissals that no one else even notices, except you. This story isn't about revenge. There's no shouting, no dramatic scenes at a dinner table, no sudden moment where everything explodes. In fact, if someone had looked at my family from the outside while all of this was happening, they probably would have said we looked perfectly normal, which, in many ways, we did. But what happens inside a quiet role can take years to understand. And when understanding finally arrives, it doesn't always bring anger. Sometimes it brings something much more unsettling: clarity. Over time, I started to notice patterns I had ignored before, not big betrayals, just small things that revealed how people saw me and what they believed I would always tolerate. At first, I explained it away, then I studied it, and eventually, without announcing it to anyone, I made a decision about what silence would mean from that point forward. This story is about that decision, about how a role that once kept peace slowly became a position of quiet leverage, and about the moment my family realized that the person they thought was invisible had been paying attention the entire time. Not with anger, just with patience. Before I tell you how all of that unfolded, I want to ask you something simple. Have you ever looked back at your place in a family or a group and wondered if the role people gave you was one you ever truly chose? In my family, roles were rarely spoken out loud. They just settled, like dust on furniture, gradually, quietly, until one day everyone accepted that this was simply how things looked. I was the middle child, not the oldest who carried authority and not the youngest who drew attention. My older brother Daniel was the confident one, the one people expected to lead. My younger sister Rachel was the expressive one, emotional, vibrant, impossible to ignore. And me? I was the reasonable one, the one people turned to when something needed to be explained calmly. When I was younger, that role felt almost flattering. Teachers described me as mature for my age. Relatives would smile and say things like, "Isabel is the easy one." At family gatherings, if tensions started building, which they often did, someone would inevitably look at me. "Isabel, can you talk to him? Isabel, you understand both sides. Isabel will figure it out." And I usually did. Not because I enjoyed it, but because I thought that was what responsible people did. For a long time, I thought peace in a family meant staying quiet. When Daniel got frustrated with our parents about money, I would sit with him afterward and listen until his anger softened. When Rachel felt misunderstood, I would be the one who reassured her that no one meant to hurt her feelings. Even when our parents disagreed with each other, sometimes they would talk to me separately, almost like I was a translator between two languages. At the time, I believed that meant they trusted me. And maybe they did. But trust inside a family can slowly transform into something else without anyone noticing. Expectation. I avoided conflict whenever possible and tried to keep everyone comfortable. Eventually, I realized that silence can mean many different things. At first, my silence meant patience. Later, it meant reliability. Eventually, it meant something else entirely. But that shift didn't happen all at once. Back then, I was simply the one who stayed calm. When I started helping with the financial side of the family business in my late 20s, the same dynamic continued. My parents ran a modest logistics company. Nothing glamorous, but stable. It had supported our family for decades. Daniel handled operations. He liked making big decisions and talking about expansion plans. Rachel worked in marketing, where her energy and creativity fit naturally. My role was quieter. Numbers, budgets, contracts, the kinds of things people were grateful for but rarely paid much attention to. And that suited everyone just fine, because I wasn't the type to argue about credit. If a meeting became tense, I was the one who softened the conversation. If someone overlooked my contribution, I didn't correct them, not out of resentment, out of habit. Over time, people stopped asking whether I minded. They simply assumed I didn't. Family dinners reflected the same pattern. Daniel would dominate the conversation, explaining his latest ideas for the company. Rachel would jump in with stories about clients or campaigns. My parents listened with pride, and when I spoke, it was usually to clarify something practical. Taxes, payroll schedules, vendor agreements, useful things, just not exciting ones. Looking back, I realized something subtle about those moments. No one ever interrupted me. No one dismissed me directly, but there was a kind of quiet hierarchy in the room. Some voices shaped the direction of things. Other voices kept the system functioning. Mine was the second type, and I accepted that, because being needed felt meaningful, even if being noticed did not. For years, nothing about this arrangement felt wrong. In fact, if someone had asked me then whether I was happy with my place in the family, I would have said yes without hesitation, because from where I stood, everything looked stable, respectful, balanced. The truth is, the role people give you doesn't usually feel uncomfortable at first. It feels familiar. It feels safe. And sometimes you don't realize what that role really means until a very small moment reveals it. Not a big betrayal, just a small cut, the kind that no one else even remembers, except you. The first moment that stayed with me wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no arguments. In fact, if you had been in the room that day, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything unusual at all. It happened during one of our regular Monday meetings at the office. Every week, the four of us, my parents, Daniel, Rachel, and I, would sit in the conference room to review operations. The room itself was simple. A long oak table, a whiteboard on the wall, and a window that looked out onto the loading yard where trucks came and went all day. Daniel usually led the meeting. He enjoyed that role. He liked speaking with authority, outlining plans, and setting the pace of the conversation. That morning, he was explaining a new contract with a regional distributor. "We'll need to increase deliveries by about 20%, he said confidently. "It's a good opportunity." Rachel nodded enthusiastically. My parents looked impressed. I had spent the previous evening reviewing the contract details and the projected costs. The numbers were tight, tighter than Daniel realized. If we accepted the deal as written, our margins would shrink dangerously during the first year. So when Daniel paused, I spoke. "Before we finalize it," I said calmly, sliding a printed report across the table, "there's something we should look at." Everyone turned toward me. I explained the numbers slowly. Fuel costs, driver overtime, insurance adjustments. Nothing emotional, just facts. "If we renegotiate the delivery schedule slightly I said, "we can avoid taking a loss in the first quarter." For a moment, the room was quiet. Daniel glanced at the pages I had prepared. Then he leaned back in his chair and waved his hand lightly. "We'll figure that out later," he said. It wasn't dismissive in an obvious way. It sounded casual, almost reassuring. Rachel picked up the conversation immediately. "Honestly, the marketing potential from this partnership is huge," she said. "It could open doors with other distributors." My father nodded. "That's true," he said. "Momentum matters." And just like that, the meeting moved on. No one argued with me. No one said my analysis was wrong. They simply continued, as if what I had said wasn't particularly important. At the time, I didn't protest. For a long time, I thought peace in a family meant staying quiet. So I closed the folder of reports and let the discussion continue. I avoided conflict whenever possible and tried to keep everyone comfortable. Eventually, I realized that silence can mean many different things. Back then, my silence meant something simple. It's not worth pushing. Daniel was excited about the deal. Rachel believed in the opportunity. My parents liked seeing the business grow. If I insisted too strongly, the meeting might become tense, and tension was something I had spent most of my life trying to prevent. So I let it go. The meeting ended with everyone feeling optimistic. Daniel looked energized. Rachel was already brainstorming campaign ideas. My parents talked about the company's future in a tone that sounded proud. As we gathered our papers, Daniel smiled at me. "Thanks for looking over the numbers," he said casually. Then he added something that sounded like a compliment. "You're always good at catching the little details." Little details. The phrase stayed with me, not because it was insulting, but because it quietly defined something. In Daniel's mind, I wasn't the person shaping the decision. I was the person checking the margins afterward, the one who noticed things once the important conversations were already finished. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. Someone had to watch the numbers. Someone had to make sure the business stayed stable. And if that someone happened to be me, that was fine. But later that night, when I sat alone at my kitchen table reviewing the contract again, I wrote something in my leather notebook. Just a short sentence. They hear me, but they don't adjust. It wasn't anger that made me write it. It was curiosity. Because sometimes the smallest moments reveal patterns you hadn't noticed before. And once you start noticing patterns, they tend to appear everywhere. After that meeting, nothing changed. At least not in any way that anyone else seemed to notice. The contract Daniel was excited about moved forward exactly as he had planned. Rachel launched a bright, energetic campaign announcing the partnership. My parents spoke proudly about the company expanding into new markets. From the outside, it looked like progress. And in many ways, it was. But a few months later, when the first quarterly reports came in, the numbers looked almost exactly the way I had predicted. Fuel costs had risen. Drivers were logging overtime to keep up with the schedule. The profit margin was thinner than anyone expected. No one panicked. The business was still stable. But during our next Monday meeting, Daniel frowned slightly while reviewing the spreadsheet on the screen. Huh, he said. Margins are tighter than I thought they'd be. Rachel leaned forward and is it temporary? She asked. I already knew the answer. I had calculated it weeks earlier. It will stabilize eventually, I said calmly. But the first year will be tight unless we adjust the delivery terms. For a moment, Daniel studied the numbers again. Then he nodded slowly. Okay, he said. Let's monitor it. And the meeting moved on. No one mentioned the report I had presented months earlier. No one connected the dots, not intentionally. But that was the moment I started noticing something subtle. When my observations were proven right, they didn't become more important. They simply became background information, the kind of quiet correction people absorb without reflecting on where it came from. At first, I told myself this was normal. After all, the business still functioned well. Daniel handled operations confidently. Rachel brought energy and creativity. My parents kept the company grounded in experience. My role was different. I was the stabilizer, the one who noticed risks before they became problems. But stabilizing something also means standing very still. And over time, that stillness began to shape how people treated me. During meetings, I was often the last person to speak. Not because I was hesitant, because everyone assumed my input would come later, once the decisions were already moving forward. When I raised concerns early, they were acknowledged politely, but rarely explored. When I confirmed those concerns later with numbers, they were accepted quietly. The pattern repeated often enough that it stopped surprising me. For a long time, I thought peace in a family meant staying quiet. And silence, when practiced long enough, becomes a kind of language people learn to interpret. In my case, they interpreted it as agreement. Or perhaps as flexibility. I avoided conflict whenever possible and tried to keep everyone comfortable. Eventually, I realized that silence can mean many different things. Back then, I told myself my silence meant maturity. It meant I understood that every conversation didn't need to become a debate. It meant I trusted the process. But the truth was more complicated. Each time a concern was brushed aside, a small part of me made a quiet adjustment. Not emotionally, observationally. I began paying closer attention to the way decisions actually formed inside our family. Not just the words people spoke, but the momentum behind them. Daniel introduced ideas with confidence. Rachel amplified them with enthusiasm. My parents valued energy and forward motion, and I translated the consequences afterward. Once I noticed that pattern, I couldn't unsee it. It showed up in small, everyday moments. At dinner, Daniel would talk about expanding into another region. Rachel would immediately imagine the marketing potential. My parents would discuss long-term growth, and eventually someone would look toward me. Isabel, does that make sense financially? I would explain the numbers calmly. Sometimes they listened. Sometimes they nodded and continued the conversation exactly the same way. But something had changed inside me. Not resentment, just awareness. Because the role I had always believed I chose, the calm mediator, the stabilizer, the quiet problem solver, was beginning to look less like a choice and more like an expectation everyone had silently agreed upon. Reliable, useful, invisible. At the time, I still believed that staying calm was the best way to protect the family dynamic. But once you start recognizing patterns, something else begins to happen. You start noticing the role people expect you to play, even when they never say it out loud. Once I started noticing the pattern, it became impossible to ignore. Not because anyone suddenly became rude. In fact, the opposite was true. My family was still polite, still affectionate, still proud of the business we had built together. But politeness can sometimes hide assumptions so well that no one realizes they exist. And the assumption about me had slowly become very clear. I was the reliable one, the person who would handle the difficult details quietly so everyone else could focus on bigger things. At first glance, that sounds like respect, but there's a difference between being respected and being depended on in a way that keeps you in the background. And that difference showed up in small ways. For example, when a problem appeared in the business, the reaction was almost automatic. Daniel would say something like, "Isabel will sort it out." If a vendor contract needed clarification, my father would forward the email to me. If payroll schedules became complicated, Rachel would message me late at night asking if I could take a quick look. None of this felt hostile. It felt normal, because for years I had proven that I would handle those things without complaint. For a long time, I thought peace in a family meant staying quiet. And when people learn that you will absorb pressure calmly, they begin to place more of it on you without thinking. I avoided conflict whenever possible and tried to keep everyone comfortable. Eventually, I realized that silence can mean many different things. At the time, my silence meant something simple. I can handle it. But gradually, the role I played inside the family started to look less like support and more like infrastructure. The business relied on me, but it didn't revolve around me. I was the foundation beneath decisions, rather than part of the conversation that shaped them. The moment I truly understood that role happened during a conversation that seemed completely ordinary. It was a Thursday evening at my parents' house. We had finished dinner, and everyone was sitting in the living room with coffee. The conversation drifted naturally toward the company, as it often did. Daniel was talking about expanding our delivery network again. Rachel was describing the branding opportunities. My parents listened with interest. Then Daniel said something casually. "Honestly, the good thing is we don't have to worry about the financial side," he said. "Isabel always handles that." My mother nodded. "That's true," she said warmly. "You've always been the responsible one." They both meant it as praise. But something about the phrasing caught my attention. "No, we handle it together. Isabel helps guide the financial decisions. Just Isabel handles it." Rachel smiled and added something that sounded lighthearted. "You've always been the calm one," she said. "If the rest of us tried to do what you do, we'd probably panic." Everyone laughed, and I smiled too, because the comment wasn't cruel, it was affectionate. But underneath the affection was a quiet definition of who I was inside that room. Daniel drove in the direction, Rachel created energy, my parents provided experience, and I maintained the machinery that kept everything running, the dependable one, the one who wouldn't challenge the system because she valued harmony too much. That evening, when I drove home, the conversation replayed in my mind, not in an angry way, in a curious one. Because once you understand the role people believe you will always play, something interesting happens. You start to realize how predictable your behavior looks to them. They assumed I would stay calm. They assumed I would keep fixing problems quietly. They assumed I would never disrupt the balance of the family. And for most of my life, they had been completely right. But awareness changes something inside you. Not loudly, not suddenly, just enough to make you pause the next time a familiar situation appears. And a few weeks later, during a moment that seemed completely ordinary, something inside me shifted, quietly, but permanently. The moment everything began to change didn't happen during an argument. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no sudden realization that made the room fall silent. It happened on a Tuesday morning, a very ordinary Tuesday. I had arrived at the office earlier than usual. The building was still quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists before a workday fully begins. Outside the window, the loading yard was empty except for one truck warming its engine. I liked those early hours. They gave me time to work without interruptions. That morning, I was reviewing the quarterly financial structure of the company. Not just the usual spreadsheets, but the deeper framework, ownership percentages, legal filings, and loan agreements. Things most people only look at when absolutely necessary. As I moved through the documents, I noticed something that made me pause. Not a mistake, not a crisis, just a structural detail I had never examined closely before. The entire financial architecture of the company, the bank authorizations, the vendor contracts, the tax filings, the operational accounts, all passed through systems I personally managed. Over the years, my parents had gradually trusted me with more responsibility because I was careful and precise. Daniel didn't enjoy dealing with paperwork, so he left most financial documentation to me. Rachel focused on marketing and client relationships. My parents had stepped back from daily administration, which meant something interesting had happened without anyone consciously planning it. I wasn't just organizing the company's finances. I understood them more completely than anyone else. Not just the numbers, the structure. Who signed what? Which accounts are connected to which obligations? What timelines governed our contracts? It was the kind of knowledge that builds slowly, piece by piece, until one day you realize you're the only person holding the full map. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. For a long time, I thought peace in a family meant staying quiet. I avoided conflict whenever possible and tried to keep everyone comfortable. Eventually, I realized that silence can mean many different things. Until that morning, my silence had always been reactive. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to create tension, because I believed harmony was more important than being right. But sitting there in that empty office, another interpretation appeared. Silence could also mean observation, patience, position, not manipulation, just awareness. For the first time, I looked at the family dynamic not from inside my role, but from slightly outside it. Daniel believed he directed the company's momentum. Rachel believed she shaped how the world saw the brand. My parents believed experience guided everything, and in many ways, all of that was true. But underneath those visible roles was a quieter layer of reality, infrastructure, the systems that made every decision possible. And those systems passed through me. Again, it wasn't power in the dramatic sense people imagine. I wasn't secretly controlling anything. I was simply the person who understood how everything connected. That realization didn't make me angry. If anything, it made me strangely calm, because it clarified something I had been slowly noticing for months. People underestimated quiet roles. They assume quiet means passive. They assume calm means compliant. They assume someone who avoids confrontation will never reshape the structure around them. And for years, I had allowed that assumption to exist. Not intentionally, just habitually. That morning, as sunlight started filling the office windows, I opened my leather notebook and wrote something new. A short sentence. Silence can also be preparation. I closed the notebook and returned to the spreadsheets. From the outside, nothing about that day looked different. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't change the way I spoke during meetings. I didn't correct anyone's assumptions about my role. But something internal had shifted. Before that moment, my silence had always been about keeping the peace. After that morning, my silence became a choice. After that Tuesday morning, the outside world didn't change. The office looked the same. The weekly meetings followed the same rhythm. My family spoke to me the same way they always had, but something subtle had shifted in the way I listened. Before, I listened to solve problems. Now, I listen to understand patterns. And the difference between those two things is larger than most people realize. For years, whenever someone in the family made a decision that created complications later, my instinct was to quietly fix it. If Daniel approved a delivery schedule that stretched our drivers too thin, I adjusted the payroll system to absorb the overtime. If Rachel launched a campaign that created unexpected demand, I reorganized the logistics budget to make it manageable. If a vendor contract had vague terms, I clarified the financial details before anyone else noticed. None of that changed, but the way I experienced those moments did. For a long time, I thought peace in a family meant staying quiet. And for most of my life, silence meant stepping aside, letting other people take the lead, letting conversations move forward without interruption, letting ideas unfold even when I could already see the complications. I avoided conflict whenever possible and tried to keep everyone comfortable. Eventually, I realized that silence can mean many different things. Now my silence meant something new. Observation. When Daniel presented ambitious plans in meetings, I listened carefully to the assumptions behind them. Not to argue, just to understand how he thought about risk. When Rachel described new partnerships or branding strategies, I noticed the timelines she imagined for growth. Not to correct her, just to see how those expectations aligned with reality. And when my parents spoke about the company's long-term future, I paid attention to something deeper, their trust, not just in the business, in me. Whether they realized it or not, over the years, they had given me access to almost every financial structure that kept the company operating. At the time, they had simply trusted my reliability. Now, I understand the significance of that trust more clearly than they did. But I didn't rush to do anything with that realization. That's the part people misunderstand when they hear stories about quiet leverage. They imagine someone immediately plotting something dramatic. That's not how it worked. In fact, my behavior became even calmer than before. I stopped interrupting conversations when I saw flaws in a plan. Not because the flaws disappeared, because I had started thinking about time differently. When someone ignores the concern once, it might be an oversight. When they ignore it repeatedly, it becomes a pattern. And patterns reveal something important about how people expect you to behave. Daniel expected me to handle complications quietly. Rachel expected me to keep systems stable while she focused on growth. My parents expected me to protect the company's financial balance. Those expectations weren't malicious. They were simply comfortable. Comfortable enough that no one ever stopped to ask whether I had my own vision for the future of the company or my own boundaries. So I allowed the expectations to remain exactly where they were. Because expectations can be useful, the more predictable someone believes you are, the less closely they watch what you're doing. And what I was doing wasn't dramatic. I kept organizing documents, reviewing contracts, updating records, but now I did those things with a deeper awareness of how everything connected. Every loan agreement, every vendor commitment, every legal filing is tied to the company's structure. All of it formed a web of relationships that most people only noticed when something went wrong. I noticed it all the time, not obsessively, just carefully. And the more I understood that web, the clearer something became. The stability everyone relied on wasn't just a role, it was a position. A position no one else in the family fully understood. And because they didn't understand it, they didn't watch it closely, which meant something else was quietly happening while everyone continued believing I was simply maintaining the background. I was learning things they never noticed. Not secrets, structures, connections, dependencies, the kinds of details that seem boring until the day they become very important. But that realization was still forming. At that stage, I was only beginning to understand how much I had been seeing all along. And what I eventually discovered started with something very simple. A few documents, and a question I had never thought to ask before. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. Most of the time, it looks exactly like the work you were already doing. That's why no one noticed anything unusual in the months that followed. I still arrived early at the office. I still reviewed invoices, vendor contracts, and tax filings. I still attended every Monday meeting with the same calm tone I had always used. Nothing about my behavior suggested that anything had changed, but internally, my focus had sharpened. Before, when I reviewed documents, I looked for errors. Now, I looked for structure. For example, I started organizing the company's historical contracts more carefully than before. Not because anyone asked me to, because I realized something interesting. Many of our agreements had been signed years earlier, when the company was much smaller. Over time, the business had expanded, but the structure of those agreements hadn't always evolved with it. Some vendor contracts still contained clauses written when our delivery capacity was half of what it is now. Some partnership agreements assumed financial arrangements that no longer reflected the company's current revenue. And most importantly, very few people besides me actually knew where all of those documents were. That realization wasn't alarming. It was simply a byproduct of how responsibilities had been distributed over the years. Daniel focused on operations. Rachel focused on marketing and client relationships. My parents trusted me to maintain the financial documentation. So naturally, the archive of contracts, authorizations, and compliance filings lived inside the systems I managed. What surprised me wasn't the access. It was the lack of curiosity around it. For years, I had quietly maintained a digital record of nearly every financial interaction the company had. Invoices, payment schedules, loan agreements, insurance policies. Everything is carefully categorized and backed up. At the time, I had organized those records purely out of habit. I liked clarity, but now I began looking at the archive with a different perspective. Patterns. Which vendors did we depend on the most? Which contracts contained renewal clauses? Which legal authorizations require multiple signatures? Which ones only required administrative verification? The deeper I looked, the more something became clear. The company wasn't fragile, but it was interconnected in ways that very few people understood. Certain decisions depended on precise timelines. Certain agreements required quiet administrative coordination behind the scenes. If those processes slowed down, even slightly, the entire rhythm of the business would shift. Not collapse, just change. And no one else seemed aware of how many of those moving parts flowed through the systems I maintained. Again, I didn't interpret that as power, just responsibility. But responsibility creates perspective, and perspective brings questions. For example, why had no one ever asked for a full review of the company's legal structure? Why had Daniel never wanted to examine the financial agreements more closely? Why had Rachel never been interested in how the contractual timelines shaped marketing promises? The answer was simple. They trusted the system, and in their minds, I was part of that system. Reliable, predictable, invisible. For a long time, I thought peace in a family meant staying quiet. And because I had stayed quiet for so long, they assumed I would always remain part of the background. Machinery that kept everything running. I avoided conflict whenever possible and tried to keep everyone comfortable. Eventually, I realized that silence can mean many different things. Now my silence meant patience. Because the more I studied the structure of the company, the more I realized something important. Information doesn't create leverage by itself. Understanding does. Anyone could read the financial records if they tried, but understanding how those records connected to the company's future required time, attention, context. And those were things I had been quietly building for years without realizing it. There was no dramatic discovery yet, no hidden clause waiting to change everything. Just a growing clarity about how the business truly functioned. And the more I understood that structure, the more one quiet realization kept returning to my mind. The company didn't run on ambition alone, it ran on systems that required someone to maintain them carefully. And one afternoon, while reviewing a set of older documents, I came across something that made me pause. Not because it was shocking, but because it revealed a piece of the structure I had never fully examined before. Something small, something administrative, something everyone else had probably forgotten existed, except for the person responsible for maintaining it, me. The document that made me pause wasn't hidden. It wasn't buried in some secret archive or locked behind complicated permissions. It was sitting exactly where it had always been. In a folder labeled Corporate Structure, Original Filings, a place I had opened dozens of times over the years. But this time I wasn't looking for tax documentation or reporting requirements. I was tracing connections. Slowly, carefully, I followed the chain of legal documents that defined how the company actually operated. Ownership shares, signing authorities, administrative permissions. It's the kind of material most people only examine when something goes wrong. Otherwise, it quietly sits in the background, doing its job without attracting attention. That afternoon, I noticed something that had always been there, something perfectly legitimate, something that had probably made sense years ago when the company was smaller. One of the administrative structures gave the role I occupied, the financial administrator, broader operational authority than anyone else realized. Not ownership, not control, but authority over certain financial processes that most people assumed required multiple approvals. In reality, many of those processes only required procedural authorization, which meant the person maintaining the financial systems had a level of operational influence that didn't appear obvious on the surface. I leaned back in my chair and read through the document again, slowly, carefully. Nothing about it was unethical. Nothing about it was secret. It had simply never been a point of discussion because everyone trusted the administrative systems to function quietly. And those systems passed through me. The realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel clear. For a long time, I thought, peace in a family meant staying quiet. I avoided conflict whenever possible and tried to keep everyone comfortable. Eventually, I realized that silence can mean many different things. Until that moment, my silence had been reactive. I stayed quiet because I believed pushing too hard would create tension, but now I understand something else. Silence can also mean restraint, because once you see the full structure of something, you recognize how easily small adjustments can influence the direction of events. Not dramatically, not destructively, just quietly. The company depended on timing, payments, renewals, contractor coordination, administrative approvals. The systems that managed those processes were designed for efficiency. But efficiency also meant flexibility, and flexibility in the hands of someone who understood the structure, created options no one else had considered. I closed the document and placed my hands on the desk. For several minutes, I didn't move. I wasn't thinking about revenge. That thought never crossed my mind. What I was thinking about was something simpler: choice. For years, I had assumed my role inside the family business was fixed, reliable, supportive, invisible. But the structure of the company told a slightly different story. It revealed that the person maintaining the systems held a kind of quiet influence over how smoothly everything operated. An influence, when handled carefully, doesn't need to be loud. It can be subtle, almost invisible, just like the role I had always played. That afternoon, I wrote another sentence in my leather notebook. Clarity creates responsibility, because once you understand the structure around you, you can't pretend you don't see it. You have to decide what kind of person you want to be inside that structure. Do you continue exactly as before? Do you protect the system, no matter how people treat your role inside it? Or do you acknowledge the reality that understanding sometimes gives you the ability to change things? Not destructively, just decisively. For the first time since that quiet Tuesday morning months earlier, I realized I had reached a point where observation alone was no longer enough. Sooner or later, I would need to make a decision. And once that decision was made, some things would not be able to return to the way they were before. For several days after that discovery, I did nothing. Not out of hesitation, out of discipline. When people imagine turning points, they picture dramatic moments. Someone standing up in a meeting, making a bold declaration, shifting the direction of everything at once. But real decisions rarely look like that. Most of the time, they happen quietly while the world continues moving exactly as it always has. During that week, our family routine continued without interruption. Monday meetings, vendor calls. Rachel is discussing campaign metrics. Daniel is talking about operational expansion. My parents ask thoughtful questions about long-term growth, and me, sitting at the same table, listening with the same calm attention I had always shown. Nothing about my behavior changed, but internally, I was examining something very carefully. Options, because clarity always creates choices, and each choice carries consequences. The first option was the simplest. Continue exactly as before. Maintain the systems quietly. Support the decisions others made. Keep the family dynamic stable. In many ways, that would have been the easiest path. No tension, no surprises, just the same role I had played for years. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. If I continued exactly as before, nothing about the underlying pattern would ever change. Daniel would continue assuming operational leadership automatically placed him at the center of every decision. Rachel would continue believing growth and visibility were the company's most important drivers. My parents would continue trusting that everything beneath the surface was simply taken care of, and I would remain the person maintaining that invisible foundation. Reliable, useful, unquestioned. The second option was confrontation. I could sit down with everyone and explain what I had discovered, walk them through the structure of the company, show them how many operational processes depended on the systems I managed, ask them directly whether they believe my role should remain invisible. But confrontation rarely produces understanding. More often, it produces defensiveness, especially in families. Because once people feel accused of overlooking someone, their instinct is to protect themselves rather than reflect honestly. So I ruled that option out quickly, not because I feared conflict, because I knew conflict would distract from the real issue. What mattered wasn't proving that I had been underestimated. What mattered was redefining my place inside the structure, quietly, clearly, without drama. That left a third option, a decision that required patience, a decision that wouldn't reveal itself immediately, one that would unfold gradually, through small administrative actions that looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. For a long time, I thought peace in a family meant staying quiet. I avoided conflict whenever possible and tried to keep everyone comfortable. Eventually, I realized that silence can mean many different things. Now my silence meant something new. Intention. Because instead of reacting to the structure of the company, I would begin shaping my relationship to it. Not by disrupting anything suddenly, not by exposing anyone's mistakes, simply by repositioning myself within the systems I had spent years maintaining. That meant reviewing every authorization attached to my role, understanding which processes could be delegated, which ones required my direct oversight, which agreements would soon require renewal, and which timelines gave me the opportunity to make adjustments without alarming anyone. None of this required secrecy. Everything would remain fully legitimate, just carefully timed. I didn't feel anger as I considered this path. If anything, I felt calmer than I had in months, because the decision wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about acknowledging something I had ignored for too long. Roles inside families often remain fixed simply because no one challenges them. And the person most capable of changing the role is usually the one who understands the structure best. That night, I opened my leather notebook and wrote another line beneath the previous ones. Change doesn't need to announce itself. Once I closed the notebook, the decision was made. The next steps would be small, quiet, almost invisible, but they would begin shifting the structure of things in ways my family wouldn't immediately notice. Not until the consequences started appearing. And by the time they did, it would already be too late to return everything to the way it had been. Once the decision was made, nothing dramatic happened. In fact, the first few steps looked exactly like the work I had always done. That was the advantage of quiet roles. When someone spends years maintaining systems behind the scenes, even meaningful adjustments can look like routine administration. I began with the simplest place: documentation. Many of the company's operational authorizations were tied to outdated internal procedures. Over time, the business had grown, but the administrative structure hadn't always been updated to reflect that growth. So I started reviewing those procedures one by one, updating records, clarifying approval processes, standardizing how certain financial actions were logged. All are completely reasonable improvements for a company that has expanded. No one questioned it. Daniel was focused on operations as usual. Rachel was busy preparing a new marketing initiative. My parents were glad the administrative systems were becoming more organized. From their perspective, I was simply doing what I had always done, maintaining order behind the scenes. For a long time, I thought peace in a family meant staying quiet. I avoided conflict whenever possible and tried to keep everyone comfortable. Eventually, I realized that silence can mean many different things. Now my silence meant precision. Instead of rushing decisions, I aligned administrative timelines with the natural rhythm of the business. Certain vendor agreements were approaching renewal. Some financial procedures required updated authorization forms. A few operational processes were reorganized so that responsibilities were documented more clearly. None of these changes disrupted the company. They simply made the internal structure more defined. And when structures become clearer, roles often become clearer too. Weeks passed, meetings continued. From the outside, the company looked exactly the same, but quietly something had begun shifting. Small administrative adjustments can reshape how an organization functions, not suddenly, but gradually. At first, no one noticed. That's the thing about systems. People only pay attention to them when they stop working. And at that stage, everything still worked perfectly, which meant no one had any reason to ask what I had been quietly putting into place. At first, the changes were almost impossible to notice. That was intentional. Nothing in the company stopped working. Deliveries are still moving on schedule, clients still received the same level of service, the numbers still looked stable in our monthly reports. But systems have rhythms, and when those rhythms shift, even slightly, people begin to feel it before they understand it. The first person to notice something different was Daniel. It happened during one of our Monday meetings. He was discussing a new operational partnership with a regional supplier. The conversation sounded familiar, confident, energetic, full of forward momentum. "We can move quickly on this side," he said. "I'll confirm the agreement this week." Normally, that would have been the end of the discussion. But this time I calmly said something simple. "That agreement will need the updated authorization form." Daniel looked slightly confused. "What form?" "The one attached to the revised vendor policy," I explained. "We updated it last month." He paused for a moment, flipping through the documents on the table. "Oh, right," he said slowly. "Okay, I'll take a look." The conversation moved on. No tension, no argument, just a brief moment of uncertainty. But moments like that started happening more often. Rachel experienced something similar a week later while negotiating a marketing partnership. She had promised a promotional discount structure to a potential client. When she mentioned it to me afterward, I responded gently. "That structure needs to align with the updated pricing guidelines." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "We updated the guidelines?" "Yes," I said calmly. "They were part of the financial procedure review." Rachel nodded, slightly puzzled, but not concerned. "Okay," she said. "Send them to me." None of these moments was confrontational. In fact, they sounded completely normal. But slowly, the dynamic inside the company began to feel different. Decisions that once moved forward instantly now passed through clearer processes. Authorizations required documentation. Agreements followed updated procedures. Nothing was blocked. Everything simply moved more deliberately. For a long time, I thought peace in a family meant staying quiet. And for years, my silence had allowed the company to operate with a kind of informal flexibility. If Daniel wanted to move quickly, the systems adapted. If Rachel promised something ambitious, the numbers adjusted behind the scenes. But now the structure was visible, not restrictive, just defined. I avoided conflict whenever possible and tried to keep everyone comfortable. Eventually, I realized that silence can mean many different things. Now my silence meant consistency, and consistency changes how people experience responsibility. Daniel began asking more questions about internal processes. Rachel started checking timelines before making promises. My parents occasionally asked me to explain the administrative updates during meetings. None of them sounded upset, but there was a new tone in their voices, awareness, because for the first time, the invisible systems that had always supported the company were becoming noticeable. Not because they were failing, because they were finally being acknowledged. And once people begin noticing a structure they previously ignored, something else begins to happen. They start realizing how much they depended on it. By the end of that month, small frustrations began appearing. Nothing dramatic, just moments where someone would say things like, "I didn't realize this needed approval. Was this process always like this? Can we speed this part up?" Each time, my answer was calm and simple. These are the standard procedures now. No accusation, no emotion, just clarity. And slowly, without anyone openly discussing it, the family dynamic around the company began shifting, because the systems that had always run quietly in the background were no longer invisible. The tension didn't arrive all at once. It grew gradually, the way small misunderstandings do when people start realizing that the environment around them has quietly changed. At first, it showed up as mild frustration. Daniel noticed that operational decisions took slightly longer to finalize, not because anyone was blocking them, but because the documentation now had to pass through clear procedures. Rachel began double-checking commitments before announcing new campaigns. The updated financial guidelines meant some promotional ideas required adjustments. None of these things was dramatic, but together, they created something unfamiliar. Friction. Not the kind caused by arguments, the kind caused by structure. One Monday afternoon, that friction finally surfaced in a conversation. We were sitting around the conference table reviewing a new expansion proposal Daniel had been developing. He explained the logistics with his usual confidence. "Everything is lined up," he said. "We just need to move forward quickly." I reviewed the documents quietly for a moment. Then I spoke calmly. "This timeline conflicts with 2 existing vendor agreements." Daniel frowned slightly. "What kind of conflict?" "The delivery capacity you're planning overlaps with commitments we already have scheduled next quarter," I explained. He leaned forward, scanning the report. "Can we adjust those commitments?" "We can renegotiate them," I said. "But those agreements have renewal clauses. Changes require advance notice." Daniel sat back in his chair. For a moment, he looked genuinely surprised. "Since when are these timelines so rigid?" The room went quiet. Not tense, just thoughtful. My father looked toward me. "Isabel," he said carefully, "were these procedures part of the updates you mentioned last month?" "Yes," I replied. Rachel glanced between us. "I thought the updates were mostly organizational." "They were," I said calmly. The company had grown enough that the systems needed a clearer structure. No one spoke for a few seconds, and in that silence, something became visible. For years, the company had operated on trust and momentum. If someone had an idea, we found ways to support it. But that flexibility had always depended on someone quietly absorbing the complications behind the scenes. Now that the structure was visible, the complications couldn't disappear into silence anymore. Daniel ran his hand through his hair. "So what are our options?" he asked. "We can move the expansion timeline forward," I said, "or renegotiate the vendor agreements when they reach their renewal window." "And when is that?" 6 months. The answer hung in the air. 6 months wasn't a disaster, but it wasn't immediate either. And for someone like Daniel, who thrived on momentum, 6 months felt like a wall. Rachel broke the silence first. "So basically," she said slowly, "the systems we used to move quickly don't work the same way now." I met her eyes calmly. "They work more clearly now." No one argued with that, but the realization was settling in. For years, the family had assumed the company's flexibility was simply part of how things worked. What they hadn't realized was that flexibility had been maintained by someone quietly adjusting systems in the background. And now those systems had definitions, processes, boundaries, not harsh ones, just real ones. Daniel looked at me again, this time with a different expression. Not frustration, recognition. "Why didn't we talk about this earlier?" he asked. It wasn't an accusation. It sounded more like confusion. I answered honestly. The company had reached a point where the structure needed to evolve. "Bas," my father nodded slowly. "That makes sense," he said. And he was right, it did make sense. But understanding something logically doesn't mean it's easy to accept emotionally, because by the time everyone began realizing how much the company depended on the systems I had quietly maintained, those systems had already changed, not in a way that harmed the business, in a way that made the invisible visible. And once something becomes visible, it's very difficult to return it to the background again, which meant the next conversation our family would eventually have could no longer be avoided. The conversation happened a few days later, not in a meeting room, at my parents' house. We had finished dinner, and the dishes were still on the table when Daniel finally said what had been sitting in the room for weeks. "Isabel," he began, leaning back in his chair, "I feel like the company works differently now." His tone wasn't angry, just direct. Rachel nodded slightly. "Yeah," she said. "Things feel more formal." My parents watched quietly. I folded my hands on the table before answering. "That's because the systems are clearer now," I said. Daniel frowned slightly. "But they didn't used to slow things down like this." "They didn't slow things down," I replied calmly. "They just weren't visible." No one spoke for a moment. Rachel looked thoughtful. "So all those years when things moved quickly," she said slowly, "you were adjusting things behind the scenes?" "Yes." The word landed softly. Daniel studied me for a moment. "Why didn't you tell us?" It was a fair question, I answered honestly. For a long time, I thought keeping things smooth meant staying quiet. For a long time, I thought peace in a family meant staying quiet. I avoided conflict whenever possible and tried to keep everyone comfortable. Eventually, I realized that silence can mean many different things. My father nodded slowly. And now, he asked. Now the company has grown enough that the structure needs to be shared, I said. Not controlled, shared. Daniel looked down at the table for a second, then back at me. So the systems aren't going back to how they were? I shook my head gently. No. The word wasn't harsh, just final. Because once something invisible becomes understood, it can't quietly disappear again. After that conversation, something subtle changed in the way we worked together. Not overnight, but gradually. The Monday meetings became different. Daniel still led operational discussions. Rachel still brought creative ideas, and my parents still offered guidance from years of experience. But now, when financial or structural questions appeared, the room didn't simply move past them. People paused, they asked. Sometimes they looked directly at me before continuing, not because I had demanded anything, because the role I had quietly played for years had finally become visible. For a long time, I thought peace in a family meant staying quiet. I avoided conflict whenever possible and tried to keep everyone comfortable. Eventually, I realized that silence can mean many different things. Now my silence meant something else entirely. Confidence. I no longer felt the need to rush in and absorb every complication before anyone else noticed it. If a plan needed more structure, I said so. If a timeline needed adjusting, we discussed it together. The difference wasn't loud, but it was real. The company still moved forward, just with a clearer understanding of how every part connected. And inside our family, the role I carried had changed as well. Not the quiet one, not the invisible one, just someone whose perspective mattered openly now. There was no bitterness about the years before. In many ways, those years taught me exactly what I needed to learn: how to observe, how to understand systems, how to remain calm when others rush ahead. Those skills hadn't disappeared. They had simply found their proper place. Because the truth is, I never needed to become a different person. I only needed to stop hiding the person I had been all along. Looking back now, nothing about this story feels dramatic to me. There was no moment of revenge, no argument that changed everything overnight, just a quiet shift in understanding. For most of my life, I believed that keeping peace meant stepping back. I thought harmony required someone to absorb tension quietly so everyone else could move forward. For a long time, I thought peace in a family meant staying quiet. I avoided conflict whenever possible and tried to keep everyone comfortable. Eventually, I realized that silence can mean many different things. Sometimes silence is patience. Sometimes it's observation. And sometimes silence is simply the space where you prepare to show people what was already there. The truth is, my role in the family business didn't change because I forced it to. It changed because I stopped hiding the structure that had always depended on me. Once that structure became visible, the conversation around it naturally changed too, not with anger, with clarity. And clarity has a quiet power, because when people truly see the value of something that used to live in the background, the relationship to it rarely stays the same. If there's one lesson I've carried from this experience, it's this: being calm doesn't mean being invisible, and choosing silence doesn't mean you have no influence. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is simply the one who understands the system best. So now I'm curious about something. Have you ever realized that the role people assumed you would always play wasn't actually the one you wanted to keep forever?
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.